So I wonder when the last time was that you had a change in perspective. Just ponder that for a moment. Later on, I'm going to ask you to share, if you'd like. I'm going to stimulate you a little bit. Here's some questions, some statements that might change your perspective. Which is bigger by land mass, Africa or North America? Close your eyes, look at the globe. Anyone have a guess? On the map that we look at the most often, it looks like North America is bigger. But if you look at a Peters projection map, where the equator is actually in the middle of the map, you can see that Africa is bigger by about 4% of the total landmass of the Earth than North America. I invite you to Google that when you get home. Here's another one. If you think you're 1 in a million, there are 7,184 more just like you. That's a perspective, isn't it? Here's another one. Some castles and lighthouses are less expensive than New York City apartments. How about this one? The USA is not even in the top 50 longest lasting empires in history. How about this one? You have an ecosystem in your belly button. Changes your perspective, doesn't it? Or, did you know that chickens can see more colors than humans can? Fascinating, right? This one just kind of blew my mind. Jellyfish, this jellyfish, Teratopsis nutricula, I apologize if I mispronounced that, can revert back to an earlier stage of life after it reproduces. Wouldn't it be amazing if they could figure out how to make humans do that? I don't know. Maybe not. On average, we spend 38 hours of our life, one complete work week, stuck in traffic. And just this last one for fun. The sun is 1 in 300 sextillion stars. If you don't know what a sextillion is, it's 3 trillion times 100 billion. Or 3 with 23 zeros behind it. Our sun is 1 in that many stars. Carl Sagan says, the earth is a mote of dust suspended on a sunbeam. So I wonder if, as I was saying some of those statements, and I didn't make those up, I got them off a website. It was 10 statements that will change your perspective. And I think I didn't use one. So my question is, when and maybe how has your perspective on life been changed? Can you remember a moment, something someone said to you, an event in your life, a new awareness that all of a sudden you went, oh, like that commercial, I should have had a V8. So, ironically, I find it fascinating that this happens. Dan and I went to Solomon's Porch, not in Israel, the old temple, last weekend. but Solomon's Porch, a new church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's what we do when we go on vacation. We visit churches. Crazy, huh? Solomon's Porch was started by an old acquaintance of mine, Doug Paget. He was the youth pastor at a megachurch in Minneapolis before he became the co-founder of Emergent Village. Emergent Village is a group of people studying and training young pastors to be emergent church leaders. This is the movement that they're calling these new kind of radical churches that are being started all over the world. And after Doug co-founded that organization, he decided he ought to try one for himself. So he went back to Minneapolis from Texas, where he'd been working with Tommy Jones, and he started Solomon's Porch. Now, Solomon's Porch is that area of the temple where was the last area where the Gentiles could go in. After that area, then the women could go in, and then after that area, then the men could go in, and then after that area, then the priests could go in. But Solomon's Porch was the last area where the Gentiles could gather. So it's not a surprise that a guy was sitting at Solomon's Porch in that area of the temple, because the most people would gather there, and he'd get the most donations, right? Charity. So Doug wanted to start a church that was like that, like a gathering place for the most possible people. So what he did is, in the latest version of this church, which started in 2000, is he took all the pews out of a sanctuary of an old church. And he put in couches and big comfy chairs and bar-height tables with stools around them. And he put them in a big circle, concentric circles, with a stool in the middle that rotates. And whoever is leading worship is on the stool right there. And everyone else is sitting comfortably in these, or sleeping comfortably, in these big comfy couches. We went to 2 services. One was at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, and one was at 6 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. The 4 o'clock service, we were by far the oldest, by at least 10 years, maybe 20 years, older than anyone else there. Now, it was spring break, so they were apologizing because it was a smaller crowd. There were 50 adults. That's 10 more than you have here, and 50 children. We started the worship with some conversation, and people came over and asked us who we were and why we were there and chatted with us. And then someone went to the stool in the middle and said, and now we're going to celebrate communion together. And we do this house party style. So there's a station over there with communion, and there's a station there with gluten-free, and there's a station there with wine, and a couple more stations scattered throughout, and we invite you to get up and continue the conversations you're having and serve one another. And then there was a brief liturgy about the bread of life and the cup of blessing, and we got up and we mingled. That was the first 20 minutes of the worship. And then the children were dismissed. And then there were some more announcements about the other ways that their church, I was happy to hear that language, the other ways that their church together, besides in this gathering, they don't call it worship, they do everything they can to keep people from thinking about old, traditional, dying church. And they've got 275 young people who are members. They call them covenant partners. They've got 150 friends. We call them adherents. And they have 100 children under the age of 10. That's phenomenal, isn't it? Doug had a change in perspective. And that's what he was able to create. It's not for every church. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what would happen if you took these pews out, wouldn't it? Put some chairs in that you could reconfigure. Put them in a round once in a while. Have some drama going on in here. Just an idea. I wonder about the change in perspective of the disciples. I mean, if you look at their story, right, they had a change in perspective when they came across Jesus for the first time. Wow, this is something new and different. We better follow and see what this is about. And who knows how many times along the way their perspective changed on what was godliness, what was religion, what was spirituality, what was health and wholeness and healing, what was the church, or in their day they would call it the synagogue. What did it mean to be a community of faith? Hopefully, but then Jesus died, and their perspective probably changed again. Oh, we were so hopeful. But maybe that wasn't such a surprise because, after all, he had been a troublemaker. But then, there he was again. There he was in their midst, and the proof was in the pudding. Today, we would hook up an electrode and say, does he have brain waves? If he does, he's alive. Back then they said, can he eat? If he can eat, he's alive. Jesus showed him. Give me some fish. Give me some bread. Give me something to drink. And their perspective changed again. What Jesus had said, that life overcomes death, that health and wellness are the way God wants things to be, that the leper and the woman who bled her whole life and the boy with seizures were all loved by God, that the sick, the blind, the deaf, the lame, they were all people who belonged because God loved them. It didn't matter if they were so-called sinners, out of the norm, didn't fit into society. Life was the way of inclusion. There's a guy, his name is Dan Price. He's the CEO of Gravity Payments. Maybe you read this story this week. The company in Seattle. Dan Price, a few years back, was watching a 60 Minutes magazine program, and he saw the circumstances of some folks in Florida who were making minimum wage and had to live in their car, who were, working full time but could barely pay their bills. And he remembers sobbing. That was his first change in perspective. He watched as Seattle, a progressive city, and the fastest growing city in the United States, by the way, has upped their minimum wage to $15. And he said, I wonder how I can be part of this. So, he decided, as the CEO of the company was making $1 million a year, his lowest paid employee was making $35,000 a year, that he would cut his pay to $35,000 for the rest of this year. And then in January 1st, he's going to, no, I take that back. He's going to cut his pay to $50,000 this year, which is what he was going to pay his lowest paid employees. Everyone would make $50,000 in the company. Next year, everyone will make $60,000 in 2016, and in 2017, everyone will make $70,000. He wants the minimum wage of his employees to be $70,000. And he did that by cutting his own $1 million income. And then he said he would not take a raise until the income of the company matched the income of the company today. Who does that? Takes a little change in perspective, right? So the disciples see this guy. He's standing at Solomon's porch. And they see him sitting there, or he's sitting at Solomon's porch, and they see him sitting there, and they walk up to him. They hear him calling, and he walks over, and he thinks they're going to give him some bread or some money or something that will help him get through the day. And instead they look at him. They look in his eyes, and they tell him to look at them. What's available when we look into one another's eyes? What's available when you know that you've been seen by someone? How does it make you feel when someone doesn't just acknowledge you with a wave of a hand or as a number on a phone line, but someone looks in your eyes and acknowledges that you're a human being? They took his hand and he stood up, presumably for the first time ever. And it sounds like from the text he even danced a little bit. Now we might think starting a new church is a big deal. We might think giving up $1 million income is a big deal, but making someone walk? That's a big deal. Bringing healing into our world? You see, for the first time, this man could now be part of that community. He wasn't on the fringes anymore. He wasn't at the whim of whoever decided to pay attention to him. He belonged. He was loved the way everyone else was loved. That's the power we have. That's the power we have. If we're stuck, if these pews are really what's important, close the doors now. Now, I'm not saying we got to move pews. I'm saying we got to change our perspective. We got to think out of the box. We can't be stuck in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. It's 2015. We got to look around and see what's happening that's alive and well and full of health and vitality. You don't have to look very far. Google it. Find 1 million examples. Or go outside and take a look at the cracks in the sidewalk or the cracks in your driveway. The green stuff is growing there already. Life is way more powerful than death. Right? Frederick Buechner. Oh, before I forget. When has your perspective changed? Can you remember a moment? Want to share? Can you hear?
If you know New York, vibrant church in the good old days. And Martin was going to have the dude who was the Elkhart, the pastor, speak to his classes on contemporary church and bloom where you planted and all that. So I walked into this church and I thought, oh my God, what a dump. There had been a pipe organ, it was gone, and there were no pews, and I was served coffee when I walked in, well anyhow, it was a very contemporary service, and the place was packed, just packed, and the day that Al spoke at Union, I played the chapel service. And Al went to that service, which he called Stopping in with It. But told me he wanted me to play on Sundays at his place. Take him out of pew floor, and I had this old round upright piano. And you sing his hymns, or you used to, when you were with it. But remember the hymn, God of Change and Glory? I'll play it for the offertory, because I was thinking I was going to be singing that today. The long story short was, there's a lot of theaters, off-Broadway theaters in the village and what have you, and actors started coming there. Their chancel dramas were wonderful. Al was a playwright, and they took some of his plays, played on Broadway. And I mean, here was this little church, and it turned into a big church, and was one of the most influential congregations in the city of New York, in Manhattan. And so that blew me out myself. I mean, it more than changed my perspective. And I've got to confess, you know, just when I think I've got things down, my perspective changes every hour.
So what you're telling me is Doug had,
behind the times.
Oh, when you mentioned going back, this is no longer the 50s I'm talking about. Now maybe Al wasn't doing that in the 50s, but it was.
Yeah, yeah. So another thing that Doug does in his worship is this conversational kind of style of preaching. So he's not afraid to make a point and then say, what do you think about that? Or you want to add anything? Or so I thought we would try it this morning. So that's a great example, better than the one I was going to end with, so I'm not even going to use it. I'll give it to you later. Yeah. So anyone else want to share about a moment when they had an aha? There's the, oh, go ahead, Rick.
It seems that perspectives change several times in our lifetime. I call that part of our life's education that's going on. But, and I've had several of those, but I think probably the most relevant one to me right now is about 8 years ago. My daughter was 35. She called me up one night and said, I'm divorcing my husband. I said, gee, that's too bad. And she says, by the way, I'm gay and I'm coming out. And that will change her perspective. And I really have to say it's been wonderful. It's been good. She had masked that all those years, and it made life tough for her. She was trying to fit in what she thought society should be. But it will change her perspective. I'm glad for her, glad for my family. It's been a wonderful experience. It really has.
LGBTQ community today are the lepers, the women who bleed all their lives, the sick and deaf and lame, and those considered sinners by the world. Yep. Anyone else? See, the whole sermon should have been these stories. And that can either shut you down or open you up. Yeah, thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah, Doug, just a second.
How do they know that chickens can see more?
Apparently there's something about the eyeball that they've determines how many colors we can see. And the chicken has a more evolved part of that part of the eyeball than we do.
Maybe somebody
St. Francis, come back from the dead.
It's the number of rods and coats they have.
There you go. There you go. That's what it is. Yeah, Doug.
Yeah, I think the change in perspective moment most recently for me was the mission trip that we did to Kentucky several years ago with the youth, and going down into coal country and seeing just how a large portion of the population in the U.S. lives in poverty. We worked in some homes that were just, from our standards, appalling. The kids, it really opened their eyes. Mike Wills, who was the pastor of Central Christian, and I were working in one mobile home. We put a porch on so that they could actually have a safe way to get out of the house if their wood stove caught on fire, because that door had been locked with no exit. And so if the wood stove caught on fire, they would die. We made the plumbing operational in a bathtub that had probably not worked for 5 to 10 years. They were heating water on the wood stove, pouring it into the bathtub, and that's how they had taken baths for probably 10 years. And we gave them a working shower. So, from an adult standpoint, that was like, wow. So.
Yeah, thanks. So, one of the dilemmas is if you do church in the round and you have someone sitting in the middle, they had microphones that hung down, so that person could be heard relatively easily. But if you're going to have this kind of talk, my guess is that some of you are struggling with hearing across the sanctuary. So that's a dilemma. Y'all don't have to tear up the pews, but what a gift to be able to talk with one another, to hear the Spirit, not just from the preacher and the stuff she gets off the internet, but to hear the Spirit working in one another. That's a much more alive witness than one person telling you their whatever they find.